Welcome to episode 6 of Ethereal Threads with Eugene Tassani. And in this episode, I would like to focus on the commandment versus the laws of Moses. And the reason I make this distinction is because there are certain individuals who would attempt to use the Ten Commandments or other scripture in Old Testament to try and justify things like pedophilia, pederasty networks, trafficking. And for those who are familiar with scripture, or for those who have searched scripture and have searched for truth in ancient literature, these are just outright lies. So I wanted to dedicate this episode to understanding as much as possible about what life was like in those ancient times. Now, in the Bio-Kovo Code, books 1 and 2, I don't specifically cover the 10 commandments, but we do talk about some scripture verses and how some of these pedophile networks try to use certain ancient belief systems to justify their illicit activities. So I'd like to start with a piece of scripture from Luke chapter 21, verse 15. And I think it's important to understand that we don't necessarily have to be prophets in order to speak with guided wisdom. So in this particular verse, the verse says, "For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict." And I love this particular verse because it's so powerful and talks about how truth will stand no matter what type of lies or contrived scenarios our adversaries will try to throw at us. So let me just get right into the meat of this episode. The laws of Moses are fictitious. The 10 commandments are factual. The commandments didn't belong to Moses, but rather the Israelites, the Judahites, and the Benjamites. The commandments were from God, and somebody recently inquired about whether or not the Israelites were pedophiles. No, they were not. The book of Genesis tells us that his people lived to hundreds of years old. So the younger, and I put the word younger in air quotations, the younger wives and consorts mentioned throughout the Old Testament were anywhere between 20 to 45 years old. And there's a perfect example of this in Scripture. For example, Sarah birthed when she was in her 90s. And you can read about how old she lived to and calculate for yourself how old she would have been when she birthed. And that's why she thought having a child at such an advanced age was kind of ridiculous. And she actually scoffed at God's angel when God's angel tried to tell her that he was going to allow her womb to come to fruition and birth a child because she was already old. So do not believe the medieval rabbis who continue to add unsanctioned laws when their communities were intermingling with extreme progressive nations. In addition to the 10 commandments, which are really like our moral guideposts, there were governing laws. There was no incest, no sodomy, no prostitution. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 17. There was no sex trafficking. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7. There was no rape, no underage relations. And for those who need interpretation, no equals the absence of. So to assume that post-battle instructions were sexual would be to assume that our Creator was objectifying children. And he does not contradict his commandments or his laws. Deuteronomy was ancient Israel's constitution. And if you read Deuteronomy chapters 12 and 13, you can really get a better understanding of his compassion and how much he loathed detestable satanic rituals. This verse is about grafting in the women and children raising and weaning them as their own. He wanted no part of generational curses or trauma. So we read in Numbers 31, verse 17 to 18, that there are some individuals who would try to use this verse to justify the maltreatment of children. And here's what the verse actually says. But all the women, children that have not known a man by living with him or by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. I can say from reading scripture and comparing other commandments and rules that he dictated that this was an absolute mistranslation. The original guidance for this verse comes from Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 14. And then in Deuteronomy 16, he talks about the Israelites grafting in foreigners and widows. And in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 to 14, he talks about an appropriate way to betroth a foreign woman from a conquered land. He doesn't talk about taking child brides or raping children. He has very specific rules on how to deal with peoples of conquest. And those rules do not include child brides or child exploitation. So is it possible that in ancient Israel, no specific anti-pedophile laws existed because it wasn't a problem? Pedophilia came from other nations, which is why he instructed the Israelites to avoid their ways. Problem solved. And I guess how I would like to end this podcast is to really just reiterate that isolated incidents of dangerous stupidity do not characterize an entire nation. And that's all I have for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining.